So this closing session will have a unique format in the way we've been working so far. It will be a roundtable conversation, a reflection by different stakeholders in history, in theology, and also in government. I'll give you the timetable or the outline of the session. We'll start by listening to each of the four panelists who's been to the whole conference or to a part of the conference. On the conference itself, first reactions, a way of bringing together the threads, a very difficult exercise, but there are four people, bringing together the threads of these past 3 days. And then I will ask a more specific question to each one of them according to their expertise and interests. And we will let them discuss, first of all, among each other. And then we'll have a half an hour with everyone, also for reactions, questions, and so on, and a short concluding moment. So we can start off with first reactions from each one of the panelists. We'll start with Rabbi David Sandmel. Rabbi Sandmel is the immediate past chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Relations, ICHKIC. We've spoken about it a few times. Before that, he served as director of the Interreligious Engagement for the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. I won't go through his whole past history, but for those who are in Jewish-Christian relations, I can say that he directed the publication of Dabru Emet, which was a very important milestone in Jewish-Christian relations. Rabbi Sandmel, your reactions at the end of these 2.5 days.
Well, I have many reactions, and I'm not going to be able to formulate them in a particularly coherent manner, so let me just share some thoughts here. The first one is that as I've been listening to the papers and hearing the discussion and so forth, it's been very difficult for me to forget and focus, in a sense, because I forget what is going on in Israel. To listen to people talking about atrocities in the past, and this is a personal reaction. It's an emotional reaction. It's not an intellectual or a rational reaction, but it has been in many ways triggering for me at this moment. So that's something that has been in the background for our entire discussion here. You know, you hear about the separation of families and so forth, and then that's going on. And again, I'm not making any comparisons, anything along those lines. I'm just telling you how I have responded to being here. Studying things connected to the Shoah is always difficult, but again, just for me personally, at this moment, how much the more so is it difficult? Then there, I think we've heard 28 papers over the last 3 days, and my ability, at least, to assimilate all of that, maybe not as good as some of yours, but I find it a challenge, especially because I am not an historian of this period of time. This is about 2,000 years late for me. I don't immerse myself in these materials daily in my work. I do from time to time, but so I have a great deal of respect and appreciation for those who do. It has certainly been an incredibly rich discussion. I am looking forward to being able to read some of the papers, probably all of the papers, but looking forward to being able to read and really to concentrate and try to absorb some of the teaching. I am overwhelmed by the enormity of the task that this conference set for itself, and again, recognizing immediately that it was never considered that this was going to be definitive in any way. This is an exploration. But what struck me was the vast amounts of material that has been studied so far and that still needs to be studied, and the challenge for scholars to sift through this, to make the connections between this document and that document, to connect it to the historical moment, to connect it to what is already known, and try to create from that a narrative that attempts to make at least somewhat comprehensible things that in many ways I think will never be totally comprehensible. So as I said, I'm deeply appreciative of the invitation to be here and to participate and to learn, and to share what I can in this last session. And I would just conclude at this moment by saying that I think that this has been extraordinarily worthwhile, that I think it is a model, not only for this specific subject, but for other subjects in not only interreligious relations, but other sort of relational settings where we need to look at what has happened in the past in order to move ahead. So.
Thank you, Rabbi Sandmel. We'll certainly come back to some of the issues you raised. Next panelist who will give his first impressions, who was also the host here at the Gregorian University, the Father Mark Lewis, the Rector Magnifico, we say here in Italy, of the Gregorian University. Father Lewis is a specialist of history of art and has published several studies on the history of education in the Society of Jesus. He served as a provincial of the former New Orleans province, and he spent many years in Rome in different periods as director of the Jesuit Historical Institute in Rome, and then teaching at the Pontifical Gregorian University while becoming vice rector, and then since September 22, rector of the university. Please, your first reactions.
Thank you. I obviously wasn't able to get to everything, but I approach this not as an expert in this field. I'm more of a 16th century historian, so only 500 years away. And I think my approach to this question is much more from the point of view of an educational institution. What do we want to do with the material that we found? As a historian, the first thing that sort of emerged in what I was hearing was this is a first scratch at the surface because there's just so much to look at and deal with. And that may be, I don't know, it may be frustrating to theologians, but to historians it's wonderful because there's always something more to look at, something more to ask. Because I think it's also another thing that I heard very clearly in this is that we need to do good scientific history, not the tribunal. I took that away from the first day, and I thought that's an important move forward, I think. I think our hypotheses will be tentative at this point, but we can continue to move forward and test them. Another thing that I heard that I think is really important to underline is that we have to keep looking for new places for answers. The Vatican Archives is a new place right now, but there are still other places that we need to think about and go to look for. And then maybe the last thing that I want to say is what questions do we want to ask of these documents, of the things that we find? And I think one question that's emerged fairly clearly is, how were decisions made? What were the theologies, the political science, the philosophies that influenced those decisions? The social context of those decisions? I think all of those are really important to our study. And then how do theoretical attitudes, philosophies influence decision-making, especially at the personal level? I think there's a lot to be said when we start talking about the rescue conversations. Why did people do that when there wasn't a great deal of encouragement to do so? And finally, the hardest question is why? Why do these things happen? Saturday, I was at Auschwitz, and the didactics of being there is very important. The didactics of this event, the didactics of the Holocaust Museum is really important because we have to teach the next generation how to be responsible. So I think I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Father Rector. On my left, but I'm on her right, right-hand side, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who is U.S. Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Antisemitism since May 22. Ambassador Lipstadt has been Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia, and consultant and then member of the Council of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's known as an author of the books Denying the Holocaust and History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, and also the Eichmann Trial, and Antisemitism Here and Now, and has received the National Jewish Book Award 3 times. It's an honor for us to have you here. First impressions, please.
Yeah. Now we go. There we go. I can fight anti-Semitism, but I can't turn on a microphone. You know? It's an honor to be here. You left out one very important factoid in the short bio, is that I had the privilege of teaching here at the Gregorian in, I believe it was 2005, early on when you were hosting visiting Jewish scholars, and I taught a course on Holocaust memoirs, and it was a very powerful experience teaching things like Primo Levi here in this setting and others as well. I'll be very brief, and I'll say that I think this, as put on my historian's hat, take off my diplomat's hat, and say that as I look back in history, this has been a long time coming, almost since the end of the Shoah, but certainly beginning in the 50s and into the 60s, and ever since then, not just Jewish groups, but historians, Jews, non-Jews, and historians from all places have been asking for more information. And they have asked at the highest level of the Vatican, and irrespective of the particular Pope and those around him, it didn't happen. We are grateful to the fact that they were motivated possibly by a song that Jews sing. Some sing it at Havdalah, at the ceremony ending Shabbat, and it is said that some Jews sang it on the trains to Auschwitz about the coming of the Messiah. And it says, I believe in the coming of, it's about Elijah the prophet, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. And then it says, Ve'af al pi sheyitmamea, even though he may tarry, nonetheless, I believe. And And there were people who hung in there. V'af al pi, even though it was refused, they hung in there and fought for this and pushed for this, and it is exceptionally important. I'm well aware of the fact that when Pope Francis made the decision, he said, we are not afraid of history. And in fact, if anything, when you look into your past, then you know you will find things that are not right and are not pretty, and yet you are willing to face them. It is exceptionally important. And I want to pay tribute to you. It's always dangerous, and there are rabbis and priests and theologians here who have led congregations. It's always dangerous to single out certain people. Rabbi Sandmel will know this because you're sure to forget others, but I want to single out you and Suzanne Brown-Fleming, two of the people who really made this come together. And if you want examples of persistence, just tangle with those two. There is much work to be done and much more to be discovered. But I don't think we should say that everything is open now. There are certain things that we were well aware of and knew before, and now we have documentation. Some of them, not all, many of them, not positive, but yet when an institution and an individual and a government is willing to look to its past and see where it went wrong, it redounds to their may I use the word glory? I don't know. Redounds to their, to what we think of them and to their strength of character. And I think that that's something we see here in the opening of the archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lipstadt. Ambassador said she was teaching here in 2005, and we have continued in the Bayer Center to have at least twice, two visiting professors from Jewish scholars during each year, and this coming year will be Rabbi Sandmel. So. Professor Alberto Melloni will be the fourth and last one for this first round. Professor Melloni is an Italian church historian and UNESCO chairholder of the Chair on Religious Pluralism and Peace. He spearheaded the establishment of the European Academy of Religion. And since 2020, he's one of the European Commission's chief scientific advisors. He's primarily known for his work on the councils, especially the Second Vatican Council, on Roncalli's Pontificate, and on the history of the Shoah. Please, Professor Melloni, in the language you want to use.
Allora mettiamo un pizzico di italiano in questa serata che non guasta. Ma io ho seguito solo una piccola parte di questi 4 convegni che sono stati tenuti, perché c'era un convegno sui nuovi documenti, un convegno sul pontificato di Pio XII, un convegno sul significato dell'uno e dell'altro per le relazioni ebraico-cristiane e un convegno sul dialogo fra storici e teologici, che è la cosa più difficile che ci possa essere. E le quattro cose, dal mio punto di vista, richiamano ad un rischio che abbiamo visto accadere negli anni passati per altri momenti. C'è una specie di trend abbastanza stabile che riguarda gli archivi della Santa Sede. Ci sono enormi plotoni di storici che si lamentano degli archivi chiusi. Su Pio X si faceva una fortuna con mezza lettera di Semeria su cui nascevano dei libri e si faceva quello. Poi quando gli archivi si aprono il plotone si riduce di molto e la quantità di lavoro che può essere fatta cala in maniera vistosa. Per Pio XII, per esempio, è stato Monsignor Pagano stesso che è intervenuto pubblicando le carte del Sacro Tavolo che tutti quanti teoricamente ambivano vedere, che poi quando sono state visibili nessuno ha visto. L'archivio di Pio XII da questo punto di vista costituisce una sfida molto grossa, perché se viene preso feticisticamente come il luogo nel quale sono nascoste delle verità non dette, alla fine qualcuno delle verità non dette le troverà, perché in tutti gli archivi giganteschi c'è sempre qualcosa che dà ragione anche all'idea più stupida. Se si vuole provare a capire, il problema è molto più grande, perché Pio XII è lui stesso, i suoi collaboratori, i suoi diplomatici, i suoi chierici, le religiose e i religiosi che ospitano, che praticano il diritto d'asilo verso gli ebrei in fuga. Il mio Monsignor Roncalli, che quando scrive da Istanbul che gli ebrei sono correligionari di Gesù, fa venire un brivido di freddo a mezza curia romana. Tutto quanto questo è figlio di una storia lunghissima, e pensare di risolvere tutto dentro la querelle di un singolo pezzo di carta o di un altro pezzo di carta vorrebbe dire perdere il filo delle cose. Mi sembra che il tentativo di mettere insieme tutto questo è stato molto importante. I due riferimenti, diciamo così, dialoghisti che ci sono nel titolo, quello sul dialogo ebraico-cristiano e quello sul dialogo fra storici e teologi, mi sembra costituiscono due capitoli diversi della questione. Perché da un lato il dialogo ebraico-cristiano è una cosa che mi preme sempre dire, ripetere, è un dialogo che è strutturalmente asimmetrico. Il cristianesimo non può pensarsi senza l'ebraismo può pensarsi senza il cristianesimo. Non è un dialogo fra pari, non è un'alterità di genere, diciamo così, di coppie obbligate. Ed è un dialogo nel quale il problema stesso che sta scritto in quel religioso aggiunto alla parte della segretariato della comunità di cristiani che si occupava di questo, il dialogo religioso con Israele, fa sì che ci sia un altro problema che si apre negli anni di Pio XII, che è il problema della relazione fra il cristianesimo, l'ebraismo e lo Stato di Israele e la libertà dell'ebraismo di essere ciò che vuole essere dove deve essere. Quindi quello mi sembra un capitolo molto complicato, anche perché su questo hanno giocato pesanti interferenze, tutto quello che è stata la questione della causa di beatificazione di Pio XII. Sul dialogo fra storici e teologi invece c'è un'altra cosa che mi preme sottolineare, oltre al coraggio con cui Susanna e lei avete avviato questo tipo di confronto. C'è una comunicazione degli idiomi fra storici e teologi che deve avvenire. Se non si affrontano le cose in quello che è lo spessore teologico specifico dell'antisemitismo, quella cosa che adesso viene chiamata antigiudaismo come se fosse quasi una virtù. Lo spessore teologico di tutto questo è uno spessore poderoso, inquinante, potentissimo, che ha gravato e grava sul cristianesimo e sulle chiese come un'ipoteca difficile da rimuovere. Non è solo una questione di passare da una cattiva educazione a una buona educazione teologica. Dall'altra parte, dal punto di vista teologico, la comprensione dei grandi spessori storici è formidabilmente importante. E veniva citato in una delle relazioni di questo pomeriggio la questione del Talmud e del sospetto cristiano verso il Talmud e della inaccettabilità dal punto di vista della Chiesa, soprattutto quella bizantina e quella latina, di accettare l'autocomprensione di sé che l'ebraismo ha e la pretesa di condizionarlo e di bruciare l'autocomprensione talmudica se fosse necessario. E ogni tanto qualcuno che è necessario è saltato fuori. Tutto questo richiede una comprensione dei lunghi tempi, del lungo periodo, senza il quale si rischia di rimanere molto concentrati dentro o delle piccole ingegnerie delle istituzioni ecclesiastiche, il meccanismo con cui qualcuno decide, qualcuno firma, un altro produce, un altro verifica e alla fine non è successo mai niente perché non è colpa di nessuno, e dall'altro il peso della grande questione teologica sottostante, della quale la Shoah fa parte, non della quale è semplicemente un effetto.
Thank you, Professor Melloni. It's very interesting to see these different types of dialogue and their different methodology, framework, and so on. So I remind our four panelists that now I will ask a specific question to each one. Doesn't mean you have to be stuck by my question, but I'll try to help, lead each one into something a bit more precise on one specific question, and then you will be able to dialogue with each other. So you will need to listen to each other quite well. Counterintuitively, let's start with Professor Melloni. We also like to listen to Italian a bit. Pongo la domanda in italiano. Oh, no. You want to speak English? No? No, okay. Since, Professor Melloni, you're here as a historian, and I'd like for you and us to reflect on what we are expecting from history when we're here. We did not talk about this during our whole conference, but can we judge history, or can we judge something that happened 75 years ago, or can history be our judge? And what is the right methodology in facing historical complexity? Can you give us a reflection on this type of question, please?
Proverò. Uno degli aspetti più interessanti della discussione storica e storico-filosofica degli ultimi anni è una tesi di Odo Marquardt, un filosofo tedesco, il quale ha scritto un formidabile saggio che mi sono permesso di tradurre in italiano sulla tribunalizzazione della storia. Dice Marquardt che, finito il tempo della teodicea, la storia ne prende il posto e, anziché trovare il modo di esonerare Dio dalle sue responsabilità, la storia trova il modo di esonerare l'uomo dalle sue responsabilità, di esonerare l'umanità dalle sue responsabilità. Il rischio di ridurre la storia a una sorta di tribunale in cui alla fine poi il risultato è quello della teodicea di Leibniz, di mandare assolti tutti, è molto forte. E su questi temi ha anche delle buone ragioni, anche perché alla fine le autoritates dal punto di vista storico si trovano in fondo, no? Facendo un buon lavoro di selezione si riesce a far dire al passato quasi tutto quello che si vuole. Nella posizione del cattolicesimo romano davanti alla Shoah c'è un aspetto in più della tribunalizzazione della storia, che è quello che riguarda la difficoltà nella quale gli archivi vaticani rischiano di attrarre sempre di più il pensiero, che è quello di pensare che alla fine la questione sulla quale si deve decidere, sulla quale si deve comprendere e giudicare, per citare i santi padri della storiografia, sulla quale si deve comprendere e giudicare è se Pio XII fosse antisemita o no. La risposta è sì. Lui erano tutti cattolici della sua generazione, chi più chi meno, che fa una bella differenza, però chi più chi meno è lì. Di decidere se sapesse o se non sapesse cosa accadeva, sapeva. Io mi sono dilettato con 2 o 3 trouvaille alle quali sono affezionato. Una è quella dell'ottobre del 40, diari Roncalli. Pio XII lo riceve in udienza e gli dice: il Papa mi ha chiesto cosa pensi il mondo del mio silenzio sul contegno dei Germani, punto. Non ci dice nemmeno la risposta. I protocolli di Auschwitz, di cui la buonanima del padre Graham giurava non fossero mai arrivati a Roma, Andrea Riccardi li ha trovati e nell'ultimo libro che è uscito per la terza su Pio XII mostra come in realtà la quantità di conoscenze fosse lì. Questo risolve tutto? No, questo allarga il problema. Allarga il problema al fatto di come e quanto l'intero corpo del cattolicesimo sia stato espresso da questo atteggiamento pacelliano e quanto invece non sia stato espresso. Noi conosciamo alcune eccezioni. Alcune eccezioni sono diventate famose perché i protagonisti sono diventati papi. Wojtyla che rifiuta di battezzare un bambino salvato in una casa, Roncalli per l'appunto che dice a von Papen bisognerebbe far dimenticare i milioni di ebrei mandati a morire in Polonia, quando nello stesso momento a New York si decide di non usare più l'espressione milioni, ma soltanto centinaia di migliaia, perché sennò nessuno ci crede. Quindi che tutti sapessero, questa era una cosa nota. Il problema è quello di come si sono formate queste eccezioni, in quali sacche si sono generate. E dunque il lavoro storico è un lavoro che certo ha bisogno naturalmente di nuovi documenti, ma anche di allargare di molto lo sguardo. perché se no, se ci si limita a pensare che ci sia da qualche parte il piccolo documento che risolve tutto e alla fine teodiceanamente assolve tutto, si dimentica che la differenza fondamentale fra uno storico e Clint Eastwood è quello che Clint Eastwood cerca la smoking gun e lo storico sa che la smoking gun non esiste perché o non ce n'è nessuno, ce ne sono troppe, c'è un fumo terribile in circolazione. Per cui su questo ammonimento sulle differenze fra Clint Eastwood e la storiografia mi permetterei di richiamare l'attenzione di tutti.
Prossima volta invitiamo anche Clint Eastwood a partecipare. Oh, sorry, I was speaking Italian. Rabbi Sandmel, we can turn back to you. Since one of the main themes and one of the main questions here was Jewish-Christian dialogue, could you tell us how you think that this conference contributed to Jewish-Christian relations, or eventually hinder them? How this question can also hinder Jewish-Christian dialogues, and some of the debates shed further light on the sufferings of the past?
Well, it's my view that this conference, hearing myself through the headphones, it's just too much. It's my view that this conference is a necessary and I think extremely significant contribution to Jewish-Christian and specifically Jewish-Catholic relations. Pope Francis's words have been repeated many times. They're worth mentioning again. We're not afraid of history. I take this as an acknowledgement by the Pope that he was fully prepared that unpleasant, disturbing, embarrassing, maybe even shameful things might be revealed, or probably knew that they would be revealed. I also see those words as a challenge to other archives which are still closed to follow his lead. Now, Jewish-Catholic relations have made significant progress since the Second Vatican Council, but there's still much to be done if the full potential of post-Shoah Jewish-Catholic relations is to be realized. Confronting that most painful chapter of history, as we've been doing over the last 3 days, seeking the truth, no matter how difficult, no matter how long it takes, and it's going to take a long time, it's essential to the sacred project of building a healthy and respectful relationship between the Jewish people and the Catholic Church. Getting to this point has not been easy. As was mentioned on the first evening, Jewish groups have been pressing for the opening of the archives for many years. I've been involved in some of those efforts. Some will say it's long overdue, perhaps. You know, I mean, things happen when they happen, right? And so the archives from the Pontificate of Pius XII are now open, and historians have begun that arduous work of combing through the millions of documents to reconstruct what happened during those fateful years. I don't think we're ever going to know the whole story, even if every document in every relevant archive is made accessible and studied. There are documents that no longer exist. There are things that were never documented. And of course, and we've seen this here, there will be different interpretations of the evidence. For me, one of the most heartening aspects of that is of this is the fact that it is a collaborative effort between Jewish and Catholic and other scholars, and between Jewish and Catholic and other institutions. I think this is remarkable. I don't know, I have my doubts, whether this is what the drafters of Nostra Aetate had in mind when they spoke about fraternal dialogue. This work, however, must be done together. First, if it's not a collaborative effort, it won't be credible. Second, the different perspectives that Jews and Catholics bring to this research, and I don't mean to suggest that Jews and Catholics each have a single perspective. It's crucial to its success. nor am I so naive as to suggest that this effort will ever be resolved, whatever that might mean. Joining forces on this project is essential, but it wasn't necessarily inevitable. Now, this is also, I think I want to go a little broader here. This is not the first instance of Jewish and Catholic scholars collaborating. I note that most of the members of the Council of Centers for Jewish-Christian Relations, most of the institutions are based in Roman Catholic institutions of higher learning, including the Bea Center. And I would also mention in this regard the 2019 Conference on the Pharisees, organized by the Gregorian and the Biblicum and sponsored by the American Jewish Committee and the Italian Bishops' Conference, also brought Jewish and Catholic scholars together to address another neuralgic topic, the image of the Pharisees in the New Testament and subsequent Christian teaching. Understanding who the Pharisees really were as compared to how they've been portrayed is essential to the process of eliminating anti-Jewish rhetoric from Catholic preaching and catechesis. I bring this up because I want to locate our conference this week within the broader context of contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. The legacy of the Shoah may be the most challenging subject that Jews and Catholics, but it's not just a Jewish-Catholic issue, I think it's a broader Jewish-Christian issue, must confront in the evolving relationship, which is perhaps why it's taken so long to get here. But there's now a history of working together on difficult issues. What was perhaps unthinkable 60 years ago has become a reality. So I want to conclude this reflection with two quotations from Jewish tradition. The first is the moral of a Hasidic story. I won't tell you the whole story, but it's the moral from the story, which is, you cannot honestly say you love me if you don't know what causes me pain. The history of the Pontificate of Pius XII and the Church and the Shoah is certainly painful for us as Jews. And I think Jews need to be cognizant that it is also painful differently, but painful for Catholics as well. We must continue to learn what causes each other pain. And the second is from Pirkei Avot, perhaps overused, but I think it's fitting. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, it's not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. The specific work represented by this conference may never be completed, and the same goes for Jewish Christian, and here I have the word reconciliation, but thanks to Professor Maayan, I'm now going to put a question mark after that. This work may never be finished, but I believe it is sacred work that we cannot neglect and from which we cannot desist.
Thank you, Rabbi Sandmel, for putting all this in context. And also, this is, you've reminded us, we've heard this quite a few times, that it'll be difficult, well, we still need a lot of time, and it may be difficult to ever get to some sort of a final, systematic, complete conclusion on the past. So I'd also, this doesn't mean we need to turn only in this direction, but I'd like us to turn towards the future. What does this conference, or what does our work together, what can it bring for the future? Ambassador Lipstadt, maybe the most basic but the most important question: how can we learn from the past to avoid making the same errors in the future?
I'll start with a surprising answer: I don't know. And anyone who claims to know is what we would say in the south of the United States, whistling Dixie. It's a hopeless, history is not designed simply as, if you know what happened bad, then you're going to move forward doing good. I think the history of anti-Semitism teaches us otherwise. Anti-Judaism, Jew hatred was so baked into the culture of so many institutions, including this institution of the Roman Catholic Church from the very beginning. There were those who acknowledged it at different stages, and yet it persists, and it persists today. And I don't mean today figuratively, but I mean today if you're seeing some of the demonstrations and some of the expressions about what is going on and what happened in Israel and feelings about that. Having said that, I want to keep, and I'll keep reiterating the point that I made at the very beginning. I think this is a significant moment because opening up the archives, being willing to know where, or be willing to go where the documents will lead you. And it is true, some will interpret the documents one way, some will interpret them another way. But there's no real debate here, you'll forgive me. I've heard people talking about debate. There's no real debate here. The preponderance, and there's more to know, but we have sitting amongst us historians whose work has shown us overwhelmingly, and as a number of you have already said, Pope Pius, the Vatican hierarchy knew precisely what was going on. The German government, the German leadership, and I don't use the word Nazi, I use the word German, knew that they could expect no criticism and no outcry about what was going on. Were there church nuncios, parish priests, and everything in between who saved Jews? Yes. Were there those who hid Jews? Of course. But what that proves is how much more could have been done. Now, having said all that, I go back first to the point I made earlier, and a number of my colleagues up here have made as well. All the more credit to Pope Francis, all the more credit to all those around him who have opened up these documents. It would have been easier to continue to say, no, we can't, it's too much, it's unclear. The question is, and to go to your specifically to your point, what will people do with it today? There will be those who will look and say, aha, you see, anti-Semitic once, they continue to be anti-Semites, which of course is a silly and short-sighted kind of view. The change in Catholic-Jewish relations is phenomenal, and I remember Rabbi Wolf Kelman, one of your predecessors, who in the 60s was fighting for this and looking for this. But that future, I mentioned earlier, nonetheless, the nonetheless phrase. The future can be built nonetheless, despite this horrific history, despite the willingness at so many crucial moments to look the other way. Yesterday, I took time out from this conference to walk the 1,000 steps from St. Peter's to the military college. I didn't have to take a lot of time out of this conference to do that. It's a very short walk. And when 1,000 people are walking that way or being brought that way, you can't not know it. That doesn't mean that the future has to be built on a mea maxima culpa basis, chatati, we have sinned. I think you recognize the past and then you say, we aren't going to let those kind of things happen again in the future. You look honestly at the past. There are those, and I've met them, and I've argued with them, and I've been lectured by them, not successfully from their perspective, how this is all untrue and it was only good things. And that's just, again, living in fantasy land. But yes, terrible things happened. Yes, an institution whose major authority is moral authority. Hannah Arendt said it years ago. This institution's, the strength of this institution is not in its armies and not in its troops, but in its moral voice. And a moral voice was lost. A moral voice was absent. A moral voice wasn't voiced, wasn't expressed. We can build on that. We can repair that. We can move forward from that. And I think recognizing it, and with this I'll close, recognizing it, acknowledging it, is the basis for a much stronger relationship. In our personal relationships, in our institutional relationships, if there's a big secret, if there's something that isn't expressed, the relationship is never a solid relationship. If one partner or the other or both have gone wrong in some way and they acknowledge that, that's the basis for a better relationship. Don't be afraid of the past, especially acknowledge it. I'm reminded of the character in the beginning chapters of the book of Exodus, the butler, Pharaoh's butler, who had promised the young Hebrew lad, Joseph, that he met in the prison, that when he got out, he would tell Pharaoh that there's a young Hebrew lad there being held unfairly. When he came, he didn't. He forgot. He forgot this young Hebrew lad who had told him, he dreamt you'll be free. And he said, if I'm freed, I will certainly tell Pharaoh that you're being held here unfairly. And he didn't. And then when Pharaoh dreamt his dreams and needed someone to interpret it, the butler remembered suddenly. And he said to Pharaoh, Et chata'ai ani maskir hayom. My sins do I acknowledge today. There is this Hebrew lad. I think all of us have to be willing to recognize our shortcomings and then move forward to a much stronger relationship.
So Ambassador said she didn't know, which is true, how to build the future, but recognizing really and expressing the past is the basis. I'm going to ask the same kind of question to Father Lewis, but since he's also a specialist of history of education, maybe how can the relation between history and education help us? How can history help us educate the next generation?
So my absolute first thought was to start whistling Dixie. But I think, as a historian, and I think we're always stuck with that question, what's it good for? What's it useful for? And I would make a couple observations. Basically, we all live in the past because the present is instantaneous. So who we are, our identity, how we understand things are based on a series of our remembering, how we remember our events. And our memories are not 100% accurate. So history has a very important role to play in who we are and how we see ourselves. So I think that's a really important thing. The other thing, it occurs to me that's really, really important, that you really don't realize it until you're teaching young people. And you realize that a lot of the things that are ingrained in our memories and in our minds don't exist. When I went back to the US and started teaching, they had this fun little thing where at the beginning of each year they would say, the incoming freshmen don't know why they call a person a disc jockey, because discs are gone. Or they don't know why the icon of the telephone has a dial on it. There are a lot of things that are just simply not part of their memory because they didn't have that experience. And so history has a real role to play in teaching the past that is not part of their experience. For this history, it's even more important because it's so filled with moral indignation. It's one of the few moments where you have good and evil. We have good people making bad decisions. We have sometimes bad people accidentally making good decisions. But in the end, looking at the painful event, and I'm glad you used that word because it's painful. It's not fun to look at this history. but it's really important because it teaches us what is important. One of the discussions that came up that I heard maybe for the first time, and it sort of fascinates me, is to what extent someone's way of looking at the world, their philosophy, their theology, all of that, affects the way they deal with real people around them. That's a key question. It amazes me that people deny the Holocaust, or worse, don't even know about it, haven't heard the story. I think that's worse because there's a sense of just plain ignorance. The other thing that, and I think I tend to start out optimistic and go dark, and maybe that's where we're very opposite. You start out saying, can't do much, but then end up very optimistic. I think one of the key things that we also remember in this is human nature is capable of a great deal of evil. Human nature is capable of a great deal of good, and we have the choice. And we have to know what those choices are, and we have to know other people made choices like that, and whether we want to follow them or not. Knowing that the other, and I think that's important too, is human, that we are sharing that brotherhood, sisterhood, is also an important part of history. If we don't come to know each other through that means, then we miss a chance to know our own selves.
Thank you for these two takes on the future that complete each other or that sort of support each other. As announced, do the panelists want to react to each other's answers, ask questions about what was said?
Well, I want to pick up on something that Professor Melloni said. He mentioned the asymmetry in Jewish-Christian relations. And he said that Judaism can think of itself without Christianity, but Christianity cannot think of itself without Judaism. And I think you are correct that Judaism can think of itself without Christianity, but I would ask whether it should, whether that's a good thing or not, in part because I think that because of the nature of the relationship between Jews and Christians over the centuries, there has been an unwillingness within the Jewish community to recognize even how the Jewish world has shaped itself, in a sense, in some ways, in reaction to to what has been going, to the competition and in the early days, and then the discrimination in later days. When I teach what is often mistakenly called the parting of the ways, but when I teach about the evolution, one of the things that I talk about is that you have two crises. You have a crisis within the Jewish community, which is the destruction of the Second Temple. You have a crisis within among the followers of Jesus, which was his arrest and execution, and then the experience of his resurrection. But the question for both communities was, what does it mean for us to be Jews or followers of Christ in this new situation? And some of that, I say that in a sense, as the rabbis begin to develop what it means to be Jewish in a post-temple world and in a rabbinic world, to some extent, they're looking over their shoulder at what is going on in this sort of competitive thing that's appeared on the horizon, which becomes Christianity. And, and at some sense, at some points, they're saying, well, if those folks are doing this, we're not going to do that. And the same thing is happening, I think, within the Christian world as well. So while it is certainly true that Jews do not encounter Christians and Christianity, in our synagogue life and in our ritual life, the way that Christians encounter Jews and the Jewish tradition, the idea that that there has been no influence over the centuries, I think, is one that we should that is worth examining. So, and again, I'm not rejecting what you're saying at all. I'm simply sort of expanding on that.
Cool. We can either react immediately if, or we can. You want to say something? Okay. Yeah, maybe you can react immediately.
No, ma reagisco su un punto che a me sembra una delle cose più rilevanti del dialogo ebraico-cristiano di questi tempi. Le capacità del cristianesimo di travestire il supersessionismo sono illimitate, assolutamente illimitate. E l'istinto supersessionista delle tradizioni cristiane è potentissimo, poderoso, fa parte della parte di DNA della Chiesa dei Gentili, che è diventata l'unica che è rimasta e rimarrà l'unica che c'è, ed è sconfinato. Allora, per me la sottolineatura della simmetria è importante, perché nella simmetria ci sono delle cose che vengono alla luce e che toccano anche i tempi di cui stiamo parlando. Il professor Wolf ha scritto un saggio molto importante in uno dei suoi volumi sugli amici Israel, quelli che volevano togliere il perfidis dalla preghiera del Venerdì Santo, alla fine di un tempo nel quale quello che era un termine tecnico abbastanza banale, perfidi, era un eufemismo per dire di altra fede, però si era caricato di una quantità di odio e di risentimento molto forte. Lì c'è stata la consapevolezza del fatto che la simmetria voleva dire farsi carico del problema, non semplicemente oggettivarlo. Si poteva oggettivare il perfidis e di dire il perfidis è una parola neutrale, non c'è nessun problema, perché non usarla? È una parola tecnica. Invece gli amici Israel tentarono di fare quell'operazione, andò male. L'abate Schuster fu severamente redarguito e poi la cosa arrivò fino alla Quaresima del 59, in cui Papa Giovanni la tolse. Con l'ambasciatore Lamdan, quando abbiamo fatto un convegno a Gerusalemme su Nostre Tate, abbiamo ripubblicato il messale da cui Papa Giovanni cancella con la penna perfidis, perché nel 72 lo ristampano col perfidis, dice dove tanto il Papa muore, quindi lo si può rimettere tranquillamente. E questo tema della simmetria secondo me è molto importante, perché costituisce uno dei punti di autocomprensione del Nuovo Testamento stesso. C'è per esempio un uso della predicazione cristiana, anche quella apparentemente più innocente, che usa le categorie del farisaismo in un senso morale. I vicini di casa del rettore del biblico ci spiegheranno che il farisaismo del Nuovo Testamento è un termine assolutamente tecnico, non ha nessuna connotazione negativa, è la polemica con il gruppo che è più vicino al gruppo di Gesù e dunque rispetto al quale bisogna marcare più fortemente le distanze. Però anche quello è un termine che ha avuto una capacità di concimare i semi di odio, che sono sempre molto pericolosi. Ed è per questo che nel dialogo ebraico-cristiano io trovo che sia importante mantenere quella categoria di simmetria, perché questo fa sì anche che, questo è l'insegnamento gesuano puro, ci sia un atteggiamento di piccolezza davanti all'altro. L'alterità del Nuovo Testamento è un'alterità di pari, è un'alterità diversa. L'unico punto d'appoggio neotestamentario che io vedo al dialogo ebraico-cristiano è l'Ogion su Giovanni il Battista, in cui Gesù dice che nessuno fra i nati di donne è più grande di Giovanni, e che è la rappresentazione, secondo me, plastica di questo tema della simmetria. Questo, vengo solo un attimo dalle parti di casa mia, questo è un valore di carattere storiografico, perché decodificare storicamente quelle che sono le nicchie del supersessionismo, gli effetti del supersessionismo, è impressionantemente rilevante ed importante per riuscire a capire i testi per ciò che significano e non semplicemente per ciò che gli si può domandare gentilmente o in maniera più aggressiva di far dire, e poi le fonti sono gentili e alla fine lo dicono quello che si vuole.
This is for you, Father. We're talking about history, but I'm going to ask about the future. Do you think that there is, or maybe even present, it's right now, and we do know some of what's happening right now. How deep do you think is the discomfort within the Vatican, the various institutions surrounding it, the historians associated with it? How deep is the discomfort with what is coming out and what yet might come out about the failings of not only the Vatican in general, but Pope Pius XII in particular, and some of those who succeeded, and because they were at his right hand? Is there a feeling that, oh my God, we've got to only look at the positive, we can't, that to somehow acknowledge these failings will be a cardinal wrongdoing, I don't want to say sin, to the history and the status of Pope Pius?
I think it's a very good question, and I think you'd probably get as many different answers as there are people in the room.
But I'm asking you.
So I'll give my answer, and if you start throwing things, that's fine, especially if it's food. I think there are a couple things that play here at this particular point in time. I think the Church, before Vatican II, certainly, and even to a large extent after, you talked about a moral force. And I think for that to work, there was a sense that we have to be perfect. That's not possible. And I think especially with the sexual abuse scandals, that were hidden pretty extensively for a long time, and we have a lot of information on that too. There was this great desire to present a church that is perfect. Probably a little bit like all of us want to present our best face forward. All of us realizing that there's stuff hidden in our lives that we don't want public because it's embarrassing, because it's sinful, because it's bad. So I think that's a little bit of the dynamic. I think it's probably becoming a lot easier to look at this period because we went through the abuse. Because I think it's becoming more and more difficult to say that the only way you can be a moral leader is by being perfect. Because if we wait until we get to that point, we'll always be silent. And I think the question then becomes, how do we confront the fact that we have done evil and say, but that is not who we want to be or who we are now or what we want to do in the future when we're confronted with new temptations. So I think I keep going back to the teaching of history, the painful study of this has to teach all of us something. And if it teaches us nothing else, then we do bad things, and we have to stop that and acknowledge it and move forward. And both of you had very good stories about that. You know, the whole of Scriptures is that. We've messed up, now we've got to get back online, and we're still loved. So I think that's part of where it's going. That being said, any individual in the Vatican or any place else in the Church will either frame the question in such a way that we look better or look worse. And we've already seen enough of that. And as historians, the great thing is you can take somebody who's got a very narrow focus and say, okay, what does what does that tell us about the larger picture? And I have a student here, so I'll repeat what I've told her before. If you just take the secondary sources and say, okay, this is the definitive word, then you're not doing history. You critique it, you ask, why didn't they look at this? Why didn't they extend the frame a little bit farther? And that's how we learn more about ourselves. Because ultimately, historians say a lot about themselves by what they choose to study. And that's an interesting self-reflection as well.
Does one of the panelists want to ask a question to Ambassador Lipstadt? Because so far we've been working with the three other questions. Maybe I can just add something to Ambassador Lipstadt's question and to Father Lewis's answer, but it will not be at all at the same level of reflection, but it's something that I was thinking for myself personally during these 3 days. I hope it will be helpful, but I was struck by the fact that I imagine that if I personally, as a Catholic and a priest, and now a bishop, if I had been in a conference like this 10 years ago, it would have been much more difficult for me personally to confront the questions we've been talking about. And I see that I've had a personal evolution, a bit in the sense of maybe it's maturity, maybe it's I don't know what, but understanding that it's not perfection that's the question, it's truth. It's also conversion in the sense of teshuva. And I feel that I needed time to go this way, and that probably for the church, as for any religious institution or any institution, it'll depend on how every individual goes through these steps of maturity.
As you were talking, it occurred to me, going back to what I said at the very beginning of the presentation, one of the things that has impressed me about the Holocaust Museum and a lot of the institutions that present this to the public is the didactics. I think it's worth asking you to explain how you get to the point where you can present something in very short time, very short space, with limited resources, in such a way to allow people to experience a little bit of the pain and the tremendous nature of it, but also leave space for them to reflect on their own, how it affects them. Because I've been impressed that it's not propaganda, it's not you need guilt tripping, it's really an education on values, and I think it's worth reflecting on that a little bit.
I'm a historian, I'm not a theologian, so I like to think I don't teach values, but as I think you were the one who said the choices we make, as someone once said that to someone, they laughed at me, to which I didn't take kindly until they explained it, and they said the very fact that what you've chosen to teach says something about you. You know, I don't know how you do it, and I've been a teacher for many more years than I've been a diplomat, and I'm struggling with that, but I sit before American 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and they think, you know, my strength, how does the scripture say it? My strength and the strength of my hand has made me what I am, and no higher, it didn't call for a higher authority. And when we get to the portion of the course in my History of the Holocaust course on resistance, all of them are sure, positive, without a doubt, that had I been there, I would have resisted. It wouldn't have happened to me, you know? And I do something which is a little outside the bounds. I don't know if my in graduate school, if my teachers would have approved it, but that was a long time ago. I said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want you to answer it, not to me or to yourself. And saying, don't answer the question yourself is like saying, I'm going to say a color, don't think about that color, blue. you know, and of course you all think about blue. I said, imagine that you're in a Warsaw ghetto. And I hate the putting yourself in that place because you can't in anything, especially in something like this, but this is the closest I come to it. I say, imagine you were in the Warsaw ghetto or in any ghetto, and you had a chance, a pretty good chance to escape to the forest, to escape to maybe join a resistance group. Would you do it or wouldn't you? Don't answer. And you're given the choice, but then the reality is that you're the only one in your family with a work permit. And you know that if you do it, there's a good chance they'll be deported, and you know what that means. Don't answer. Would you go or wouldn't you go? Don't answer the question. You have parents, you have younger siblings. Would you go or wouldn't you go? And I do this in a series of questions, and you can almost physically see themselves deflating. That what they knew so clearly at the beginning, they don't know what the answer. And I don't want answers because you can't know, but I want them a modesty of judgment. Modesty of judgment. And I think that that's exceptionally important when you're dealing with this.